Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining me today. My name is Mr. Fugusi, and today we're going to have a look at the new universal wind system I've been working on. This is planned to go live on the Unreal Marketplace sometime soon, and I thought I'd make a proper video showing the trees in motion as well as how everything in the system actually works. Right now we're in the demo scene included with the project that you'll be getting if you buy this on the marketplace. So how the system works is we have two separate materials. We have a grass material and we have a tree material. The grass material is applied to grass, obviously, but it is also applied to things like these flowers, the bushes under the trees, these slightly taller flowers, and other things like that. It is also applied to taller grasses like that wheat. The tree material, on the other hand, in this scene is only applied to the trees. It is also designed to work well on vines and other such things, as well as, how to put this, is designed to work on anything, well, anything tall, basically. The trees have more of a large-scale motion applied to them, which means that they will look better on an actual large mesh. But on small-scale meshes like grass or even things like wheat, which are only large in a single direction, the grass material will generally look better because it has a more small-scale motion built in. We'll now hop into the actual materials that we have. So included in the project is a landscape material, which is seen here. It's got rocks that align their normals to the terrain. It's a very simple material. It's got a little bit of nice blending along the edges of the layers, and it has faceted normals. Due to the way I achieve these faceted normals, it is not compatible with mobile. As for the rest of the project, I'm honestly not entirely sure if it's compatible with mobile or anything other than Windows because I haven't been able to test it. Now, let's have a look-see at the tree materials. Almost everything in this scene is just applied through the regular foliage brush. The only things that aren't applied as such are the regular grass meshes and the little rocks you see on the dirt there. We'll just grab the big tree and we'll just grab, well, let's grab this flower. What you will see is when we look at the materials, obviously these all have different materials applied to them because they're low value assets and they're not particularly well optimized using an atlas or anything. Generally, I would recommend doing something like this with a texture atlas instead. But let's have a look at how it looks in software. As you can see, it is only being applied to the top half of this material sphere. That is a disclaimer I have to add to this product at the moment due to engine limitations and the way it handles object positioning in shaders. This material will only work well on objects that are, well, basically it'll work well on things like instant static meshes. And depending on your settings, it can work with the landscape grass tool, but it will not work nicely on regular static meshes. I'm looking into adding support for that in future version, but as it stands, that is not supported. Over here, we have all of the settings. Obviously, we have a diffuse, we have a base color. All of the base color parameters in this project have the alpha applied as a multiplier. So because we have to use vector 4 parameters, I figure we might as well use the fourth parameter we have access to, so that controls brightness. Diffuse desaturation is applied to the actual texture, and then that result is multiplied by base color. Color by gradient, what this means is if we have a look at the actual grass material, so give me just a second while I dig that up. Actually, I can just, it's nice and organized in this project. If I grab Am I Grass, this should have, yes, there we go. When you tick this, over here you get top color as well. What this means is quite simply, if we go into unlit mode, you'll see quite clearly that the grass tips are not the same color as the base of the grass. You'll also see that it shifts. That has to do with the actual wind being applied, but that gradient is applied based on a mesh or UV gradient, which I'll get into in a minute. Modifiers for that are gradient power and gradient offset. Gradient power is obviously the power applied to that. Gradient offset is the total offset, so just shift the entire gradient by X. These two will also still exist if you untick color by gradient, because they control the gradients for metal roughness and specular. For metal roughness and specular control, we use a vertical gradient to keep it from being shiny at the bottom where it meets the terrain. So instead only the tips are shiny, which looks significantly better than just the entire mesh being shiny as all hell. Leaf flutter is a Boolean parameter. What it does when you do that is it gives you this little bit of movement going on. If we untick that, we'll have to compile some shaders. That should be done relatively quickly. There we go. As you can see, you have way less small scale motion when you disable the leaf flutter. Now if we enable it again, you'll see that even when the wide scale motion isn't applied, it's way more wobbly. The vertical, direction controls, the wind direction. R is X coordinates, G is Y coordinates. So right now it's blowing along the X positive axis of the world. And the alpha here is strength. Blue is completely and utterly useless. Or at least it may work. I'm not entirely sure how I hooked that up, but I wouldn't strongly recommend using vertical wind, admittedly. UV as height is an important one. So for grass, we have this enabled. As you can see in the tooltip, UV as height has to be enabled in order for things to work with the grass system, because the grass system doesn't have access to its own position in the shader, which means that we can't mask it procedurally. We have to know the height beforehand, and the only way to do that is through UVs. So anything placed through the grass system has to have UVs that are mapped vertically, so the gradient can just sample UVs. Vertical power is the power applied to that. Highlight brightness is what you have been seeing here. So if we just go into unlit again, and we change the highlight brightness, you'll see that things get darker instead. That has to do with the fact that wherever the wind is currently strong, it applies a base color offset to make things look a bit brighter, so that you can actually see the wind move over the world as you zoom out. You always need to be a bit careful with it, because if you overdo it, it'll become very noticeable and weird, but if you don't overdo it, it becomes very nice looking, like the grass over here right now. We now get to flutter intensity and flutter speed. These are the controls that come with leaf flutter. The intensity is how much do things move, and the speed is how quickly do they make those movements. Then we get to the grass wind section, noise power, noise. These will just control the actual noise panning settings of the grass. And then over here we have surface aligned normals. This is another important one for the shader. If we it won't really matter much if we disable it on this grass, because it has its tangents pointing the same direction, but if you go into the normal buffer, you'll see that the grass excuse me, you'll see that the grass matches the terrain almost perfectly. That has to do with this setting in the material. What this does is it completely ignores vertex normals, but in turn you will get accurate lighting which matches the terrain. If we look over here, these flowers have it. This little bush has it. If we grab this little bush, I'll show you. Actually, let's grab these bushes. These bushes don't have it right now. If we go in here and we enable it on them instead, you'll see how they turn mushy, but in turn they blend in way more. That's obviously not desirable on all things. On these ones we've decided to leave it off because it gives a bit more contrast to the scene, looks a bit nicer. But on things like grass and even the little rocks we have scattered on the terrain here, it looks significantly better to have it on. If I grab the landscape rock and I disable it on there, you'll see that without it, the rocks look out of place because of the sharp shadows they get compared to the terrain, whereas if I enable it, they blend in very nicely, but just give it a little bit of extra detail. Now, that's pretty much how the grass works. If we just go in here, you can see we can change the speed, the strength of it. We can also really overdo the strength, and then you'll really see the different wind systems in motion. And how it pans across the entire world. You'll see that the strongly moving areas will also get brighter, but we'll just put that right back to what it was because it's a bit overkill like that. Yeah, I mean, we can overblow this for a second so you can see. But for the most part, these settings are quite alright. We can offset the noise, so we can say -1. You'll see that the grass basically just stays still. If we put it on 1 instead, you'll see that they are way more prone to constantly following the wind texture instead. This is just something that you can play with in order to make things look more dynamic. It depends on the noise texture you're using. The included one we think works pretty well for most assets you'll find regularly. So we'll move on from all of the stuff we've shown you now, and we will get to the actual tree. And quite frankly, the tree has more interesting material settings. Well, it's a more interesting material, but it's less complicated. The settings are a bit more complicated and matter more. These are largely the same as they were before. We've got the leaf fluttering thing the same there. Obviously you don't want that on a branch, but you do want that on the leaves. The same metallic roughness specular settings. Just a disclaimer, the PBR values in this project are absolute madness. They are purely selected based on how they look. I wouldn't recommend doing this on an actual realistic project or something striving to obey PBR rules. But then we get to the tree wind section, and you'll see that it's a bit more of a tower of settings. So we've got that same old direction, then we've got a boolean which is hanging plant. I don't have a material in this project that I can show it on, but what this does is it inverts the vertical mask. So for instance, on vines you will want to enable this if you hang them off the ceiling, because otherwise it won't get wind applied properly because it has a negative Z offset instead of a positive one. This just flips that around. Highlight brightness, same as before. Highlight height is more or less the same as before. But what it does is, let's actually go to the parent material of this. You'll see that when we change that, suddenly everything gets a lot brighter. The highlight material in this project is how it works is it... Damn it, why is this not working? Whew. Highlight height. There we go, 1000. How it works is it uses a vertical mask, and then based on that vertical mask it says, okay, this is where things get brighter, this is where wind gets applied strongly, and this height determines how large the transition area for that is. Down here we have a maximum highlight strength parameter. This is basically a multiplier for it, except it also takes the highlight brightness and such into account. That's just something to play with. If we were to have a very tall tree and we would put this on 5, you'll see that it gets even brighter and even more affected by the wind than these ones over here are now. But this just really depends on the settings that you expect to be using this material with. Horizontal distance influence is something you want to be careful with because it generally ends up looking a little bit janky, but applying it a little bit does make a small difference in how it looks. As you can see right now, you very clearly see that it's just a vertical gradient on this big tree here. Whereas if we enable that horizontal distance influence again, you'll see that there's way more dynamics in the actual branches outside of the main trunk. As you can see, it's a little bit wobbly, so don't get overboard with it, because you'll get this sort of thing. But it does make a big difference when you apply it slightly, because it just gives the entire tree a lot more liveliness to it. This is one of the things where it fundamentally differs from the grass material, and this is why this doesn't work with just something like wheat as well. Its strength is in branching assets, because it will actually have room to apply the noise properly, whereas with just straight assets you'll get a lot better results using this, because the grass material has a better noise system. The wind motion generated by the grass is nicer than the ones generated by the tree. A tree just has better masking, so things like, for instance, the horizontal positioning actually make a difference. So pick your material carefully for every asset. Think about how you're going to use it and just play with the different ones and see, does grass or does tree work better for this. Then from that point on, we have horizontal distance power. This is high, because if we put that low, you'll see that the entire tree just gets wavy as all hell. We don't want that. We only want the ends of the branches to get wavy, so we do it like that. Then we have a noise offset, which does pretty much the same as it does on the grass, except it's got more control here, because it isn't clamped, so you can see that we can actually really push trees in a given direction. What it lets you do is, if we put this on 0, the tree moves pretty much 50% to the left, 50% to the right. Whereas if we put this on 1.5 like it was before, you get less movement to the left, which makes it look more like it's actually adhering to the wind direction. We've then got noise speed, which is just how quickly do things move. There's a big distinction here between how quickly does something move and how much does it moves. So this increases the wind speed, but not how far a vertex is allowed to move. You want to generally be a bit careful with this sort of thing, and you want to keep a good balance between the speed and the effect, because if you ramp up the speed, you'll just get things like what you just saw. Vertical distance power, that's just the vertical masking and the power applied to that. So as you can see, parametrically, it's actually a pretty simple system, but for the assets it's meant to work with, it actually works surprisingly well. If anyone's got any questions, I'd really love to hear it. Oh, there is one more thing I wanted to point out. On the grass, we use UV as height. On anything where you have this disabled, you will need to specify the mesh height. See, that isn't listed here because obviously that is grass, so it doesn't need it. But if we go in here, you see this is disabled, and then we have a mesh height properly. For any material that will be used without that, you need to think about what mesh is this being used with and how tall is it roughly, and then put that into the mesh height, because it uses that to create the vertical mask. I have no way of knowing how tall any given mesh is in the shader, so this is the way we tell the shader that. But that means that it does need to be somewhat accurate. So if your wind looks weird or it's not being applied to the top of your assets properly, then there's a good chance you just need to have a look at the mesh height you've specified here, because we can go, for instance, to this tall grass here, and then you'll see very clearly when I did lower the mesh height, you'll see that it doesn't bend exponentially anymore. It's not an S-curve anymore. It's more like just the bottom is bending and the top isn't. If we now put this back at 120, which it was, you'll see that the top also bends a long way more nicely, We can do 200. It's better to overdo this than to underdo it, because you can always compensate a little bit in the direction and the strength of it. So we can just say, oh, we do make it a bit too tall, and then we just put it on 200. So rather go over it than go under it, because if you go under it, you'll just have part of the mesh that doesn't move nicely, and that'll be weird as hell. Okay, so this is pretty much it. Obviously, there'll be a link in the description to the actual asset if it is up on the marketplace. And other than that, I'd like to hear your thoughts. Let me know what you think of it. Let me know, well, if you have any questions, any problems with it, or if you just think it's cool. And then I'll hopefully see you guys next time. So cheers, signing off.